The following podcast is a rebroadcast of an ARC Advisory Group Smart City Digital Transformation Council meeting. If you are interested in joining the Smart City DTC, feel free to reach out to myself at jfrazer@arcweb.com. Thank you very much, and on to the podcast.
Welcome everyone to another ARC Advisory Group Smart Cities Digital Transformation Council meeting. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined with Edward Fidler, our transportation analyst here at ARC Advisory Group, as well as Rick Rys, who's an energy analyst. Of course, I'm Jim Frazer, I'm Vice President of Smart Cities here at ARC. And today's discussion really is about our transportation policy initiatives in the United States and the impacts of that around the world. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Edward.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Hey guys, good morning, and hey Rick. So yeah, just like Jim said, the focus today is going to be on the U.S. transport system, and in particular, what that might look like going forward with a Biden administration in 2021. So I'll just start it off with most of this information is coming from the Biden campaign, having worked with former Secretary of State John Kerry, who was the lead negotiator for the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. And they put together a very detailed energy and transport plan for the campaign, and that's been fleshed out continuously over the last year or two. So that's what we'll be kind of going off of, and then we'll be adding our own insights on top of that. And then I should mention we're likely seeing a divided Congress for the next term, but we'll find out for sure in a month with the Georgia election. And that might imply that the scope for change and for policy moves is very limited, which yes and no. So in transportation, the agencies of the executive branch have a lot of power over these issues. So the DOT, EPA, and even the FCC, as we'll see in a moment, are very powerful, and we'll do a lot here.
So actually, Eddie, an awful lot revolves around the two Senate runoff races in Georgia.
Oh yeah.
Because then that will determine whether there's a divided Congress with Republicans having the Senate and the Democrats having the House, or simply a Democratic majority in both houses, and that means an awful lot. So with that in mind, let's continue.
Yeah, that's what I mean when I say we'll know for sure within a month. Both those elections will be done, and we'll find out. Yeah, we'll find out about the Senate, but the point is, regardless of whether there's gridlock or it's there's a Democratic majority, the federal agencies are extremely relevant for transport and energy as well. So regardless of what happens between now and January, it looks like a lot will change. Okay, so we can set the stage just by talking about some of the issues that we're facing in transport today. So I'll go through this pretty quickly, but we have almost 300 million private cars in the US. They sit parked, totally idle, over 92% of the time. We travel about 3 trillion miles per year in those private cars. We sadly have 40,000 road deaths every year. We see about 50,000 premature deaths from air pollution, strictly from emissions from the transport sector. And we see that our cities are built for cars, pretty much. I mean, we have hundreds of billions of dollars in real estate dedicated to roads, parking, lots, garage and street parking. We see that transport is the single largest emitting sector in the US economy. And we know that we have a very serious traffic congestion problem in the US. So you can estimate that about 10 billion work hours are wasted every year. That's nearly $100 billion in opportunity cost. You have the stress and the health effects of all that, and it's just not sustainable. And on top of that, we know that our infrastructure is badly in need of repair and modernization. Okay, so that leads us into 2021 and the Biden plan. So the Biden plan falls under a few major categories. I would say the biggest focus for him so far has been electric vehicles. And so more specifically, there's a proposal to build out a network of hundreds of thousands of EV chargers. Now, the major existing networks like Electrify America and Tesla's private network are already pretty extensive. Part of the issue is that most people aren't aware of that. But that's fine. So he plans to build out many, many more. There's also a component here for to focus on US-made EVs. So to accelerate the domestic industry, the workforce, the training, and all of that. There's also a push for zero-emission public transit. And I think a big beneficiary here will be electric buses. There's also a push to electrify the 3 million government vehicles in the US. So that's between federal, state, and local. And that'll be done through grants at the state and local level and directly at the federal. And now, tangential to this, there's a pretty large piece here about moving to a fully clean grid powered by renewables. And that's pretty significant for the EVs as well, because on today's power grid, you know, EVs pollute maybe 50% less. They're 50% cleaner than fossil fuel vehicles. But as the grid gets cleaner and cleaner, that number increases dramatically. So it's pretty significant there. And now, Rick, I don't know if you want to comment on EVs and the energy system at this point, or we could do that maybe towards the end, but I'll give you a chance.
No, sure. So just to update the listeners, you know, my background is as a chemical and electrical engineer. I've worked in the hydrocarbon industry extensively, but actually over the last 5 years, I've completely switched to a whole different industry of the electric utility industry. And you know, the elephant in the room, of course, is carbon dioxide warming the planet, and that's one of the most difficult problems that our whole planet needs to solve. But the general solution is that you basically just need to electrify everything. And if you're going to electrify everything, that means transportations, buildings, and industry. You need to electrify it with clean electricity. And you know, currently, there's a considerable amount of coal-fired power plant with no CO2 capture, and even natural gas, which has got less CO2, but still is a big CO2 emitter. So we certainly see that the electric grid is transitioning to clean energy. Last year, for example, in the US, the largest source of new electric generation was wind plus solar, which exceeded the amount of generation added from natural gas. As a rough rule of thumb, you could consider that natural gas has been added to the electric grid to displace declining coal, with a net improvement in CO2 emissions. Overall, however, nuclear is also having a difficult time staying profitable. You know, as a result of the Fukushima accident, there's a lot of Atomic Energy Commission rules about investments that they must make, new safety systems, new diesel generators, new compensations for how to handle a total station blackout like they had at Fukushima. These add additional costs and training costs and fixed costs, and that makes the cost of operating a nuclear plant kind of high. and a few nuclear plants have been in slight decline. So second part of that rule of thumb is that the addition of wind and solar to the electric grid has roughly compensated for the amount of nuclear that has declined. We've seen the Pilgrim plant decline, shut down. We've seen a few others in California, nuke plant shut down, and there's no great new nuclear power on the horizon. There is the small modular reactor, but that's still quite a ways away, and it's still a little bit questionable whether it would be economically competitive with the declining costs of wind and solar. So anyway, that's kind of the big picture there. But there's a couple of comments I'd like to make about. Let me see if I can look at my notes. Is about the transportation sector. One of the huge problems that we've had in the transportation sector is that public transportation ridership is down hugely. All right, trains, subways, buses have lost huge income for ridership decline as a result of COVID-19. There's been canceled routes. There's been limits on the number of passengers that can board trains and buses to keep spacing more reasonable instead of packing them in. I remember seeing the Japanese railroads, Japanese train station where they actually push all the people in. They got packing people to pack them in. This is not good for COVID. All right. I'm not quite sure what the situation is in Japan, but I could imagine it's significantly declined. But USA Today, for example, reported in mid-April that demand for transit service was down by an average of 75% nationwide. There were figures as high as 85% in San Francisco, 60% in Bay Area, and the Bay Area Rapid Transit ridership plummeted 90% with reduced service hours. So the public transportation, now this is perhaps a temporary issue. If we see this vaccine rolling out, if we see people, will regain that. And I think, as Eddie said, the larger transportation industry as a whole, is certainly moving to electric. There's electric trains, electric buses, electric subways. The ability to manage fleets like that is somewhat easier in some ways to electrify than say individual passenger vehicles. So individual passenger vehicles have an average life of 12 years. All of the ICE engine, internal combustion engine vehicles out there, they're going to be out there for a long time. And also projections in general worldwide show that the number of vehicles will actually increase, from here till say 2050. They will increase in the US, they'll increase in Europe, they'll increase very sharply in China and India. But if you look at almost every other country in the world, you still see the total number of vehicles increase. Currently electric vehicles are a relatively small percentage of the marketplace, but there is a couple of interesting, there's still an awful lot of evidence that electric vehicles will become the dominant vehicle choice. You certainly see regulations can impact that. The country of Norway is effectively, not 100% electric. You can electric vehicles and hybrid electrics, are the majority of all vehicles purchased now. And you can still purchase an internal combustion car. And then you also see internal combustion cars banned from cities. You see the state of California suggesting that internal combustion engine cars could be banned as early as 2030. That's a pretty huge change in terms of our everyday life. It's hard to imagine walking down the city or looking out in the street in your driveway and looking at the cars passing by that internal combustion engines would be in such sharp decline. I've actually personally been involved in the electric vehicle industry. I have an electric vehicle myself, a Tesla, and we also follow the electric industry, and you can see that the valuation of Tesla is a very interesting situation. Tesla is now the world's most valuable car company with a $208 billion valuation, surpassing Toyota, its main rival, at $203 billion. In the first quarter of 2020, however, Tesla produced about 103,000 vehicles. However, Toyota produced 2.4 million vehicles in the same period. So what that's basically saying is that the marketplace is anticipating that Tesla has the possibility of growth far more than, say, Toyota does. And some of the key issues there are, for that growth issue is that, cars and light trucks, the battery supply chain is currently limiting production. And you have, in fact, in the past, you had a long wait for a Tesla Powerwall because cars had priority. Tesla is scrambling to get enough batteries to produce their cars. They produce their cars from Panasonic, they get it from CATL, and now they're developing their own manufacturing train to produce batteries. But the key metric out there is that the cost of batteries has now declined to under this magic $100 per kilowatt hour. And there's aggressive techniques to reduce that further. But that magic number was where the cost penalty, because car batteries are the largest cost of producing an electric vehicle, when that price got down to that range, that made them straight up competitive, even at first price, not even looking at maintenance issues, which are a huge advantage for electric vehicles, but that makes them competitive with internal combustion cars. So, clearly the battery issue is out there.
Rick, you bring up an interesting point about mass transit, and typically, or one of the larger obstacles that's been out there, that's been talked about at length, is the last mile problem, meaning getting from the train station, the bus station, over to your home, and the cost of that, because that often required you to have a car, and as Eddie stated, and as we all know, the utilization rate of a vehicle, of a privately owned vehicle, is very low, and frankly, they're probably the second largest asset that you purchase as an individual consumer. Some of that, there had been a rebirth before COVID in all the discussions about mass transit, because we had the Ubers and the Lyfts that could reduce the cost of a car transit because it wasn't your vehicle and you only bought it for the 10-minute trip to the train station. And now those are internal combustion engine vehicles. So that didn't recognize the lower energy, the lower cost impact of an EV. It did drive down that cost of getting you to that train station. I can imagine that as the fleets get electrified, there could be a dramatic impact in the lowering of the dollars per mile getting you to that train station, and it might extend the distance to which you could get to that train station. And even further down the road, when we do have autonomous and self-driving vehicles, that might extend that distance even much farther. Do both of you see that?
Oh, go ahead, Rick.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that brings up kind of a whole host of issues. On the one hand, many people own two cars, and the first electric cars that came out were pretty much a lot of city cars. When you have a EV range of 80 miles, that's pretty much for a city car. And also if the charging infrastructure doesn't allow you to have fast chargers, even if you had a 80-mile car range and you wanted to go on a long trip, you'd have to find a charger with 20 miles left, so and this would be a little bit impractical. So kind of the standard for long range driving is about 300 miles of range, and that's certainly achievable today. The other some of the other issues it comes up as the full self-driving capability. Elon Musk is a big champion of the self-driving. Also, you see companies like Waymo and others that are coming out with self-driving vehicles. The whole model of car ownership could be threatened if in fact self-driving becomes allowed by by traffic rules and regulations. It may actually show up more quickly in other countries than it does in the US. But if you did that, all those cars parked in the parking lot that you drive by that are sitting there unused could actually have been used. If it was so easy that you could have a very low cost Uber ride with no, because the driver of an Uber car is the significant expense. If you could order an Uber and have very, very low cost transportation, you wouldn't have to insure a car, you wouldn't have to own a car, you wouldn't have to have a driveway, you wouldn't have to plow the snow or, or maintain it. All of that would have been handled for you as long as you could immediately request a car and have it show up about as fast as it would take you to walk into your garage and get in your car. And that's a possibility if there was a huge fleet of self-driving cars. And it's certainly part of the Uber view. And maybe a little bit later in this discussion, we'll also talk about the Uber air taxi concept as well. That's a little bit further off, but may not be, may have a pretty big impact. And even drones for package delivery could have a pretty big impact on supply chain movement of materials. So there's a lot of changes in place, coming forward with regards to, I know Edward has a lot of comments on this topic as well. So maybe Edward, you could give your perspective.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rick. This is where we get into the topic of mobility as a service, which is a really, really cool piece of the whole puzzle. Anyone who wants to learn more, you can check out a podcast we did with Sampo Hiainen. He's actually the CEO of Moss Global, and he founded that whole industry. And so the idea there is, if your situation doesn't necessarily require you to own a personal vehicle, like Rick's saying, you might just sign up for a subscription service, and within that plan, you might have access to public transit, bike, scooter, rental, e-bike, e-scooter, but also ride hail, like an Uber or Lyft, and whether those are electric or autonomous, and then car share and car rental whenever you want. And just like Rick said, the beauty is you don't need to think about insurance and parking and luxury taxes and vandalism on your car and everything else. You just pay for a service, use what you need, just walk away. And we're seeing that grow pretty quickly in Europe. And there are a lot of plans to bring that to the US, especially to cities where maybe they're not so sprawled out. Maybe they're more like a European city, sort of like Boston, where we're based. So that's a really interesting piece of all this.
Yeah, it is interesting that there are planners that are, or even thinking beyond that, because if you do have such a low cost autonomous vehicle and a plethora of them in your downtown city, if you maintain the parking costs per hour at what they are typically in many urban cities, you might have a scenario where your streets are clogged with empty vehicles looking for riders. And similarly, there's been some studies by some transportation agencies in the US and elsewhere that if I have an autonomous vehicle and it plots a track on its safest and most efficient route, meaning down to millimeters on the pavement, you may have a scenario where the pavement is worn with grooves in the pavement, where human drivers don't maintain that accuracy.
Yeah,
let me make an additional comment there.
Unbelievable.
That's a programming issue. They can change that. All right. We can keep them weaving a little bit. All right. To even wear. I don't see that as a problem. But one of the problems, though, that is foreseen is if self-driving vehicles start to become very popular, those people that otherwise would take mass transit have the problem of getting from their home to the mass transit. If in fact it becomes so convenient that you can be picked up at your door, people would prefer to take a self-driving vehicle rather than find their way to the mass transit. As a result, you wouldn't have a large number of unmanned cars looking for drivers waiting around. Obviously, they would mostly be parked. You would have a lot of cars filled up with people because they prefer to take the self-driving from their door to their destination and skip the mass transit. So self-driving vehicles are competing with mass transit in the future, and road traffic is not actually improving, because people are using self-driving vehicles and clogging up the roads.
Yeah. So actually, both those points lead us perfectly into the next segment here, which is, Jim, you made the point that if we're pricing parking spaces, an autonomous vehicle might just stick to the roads and drive in circles, especially if it's electric, so it has no operating cost. So that really brings up an obvious point of we price parking, we price fuel. Why don't we price the roads? Why don't we price road use? Because like I said earlier, and like Rick was reflecting a minute ago, we have a very serious congestion problem, which could get a lot worse with autonomous vehicles. And so the idea of road user charging or mileage-based road user fees promises to fix that. So maybe via the GPS system in your car, you might pay a toll based on how many miles you drive, based on where in the city that is, time of day, demand. It can be done in a simpler way, just with cordon pricing. So in New York City, that's starting where you drive into downtown. You have an RFID scanner, just like you do for a highway toll. And you get charged for entering that congested area, and that's it. So there are different ways to do it, but it's very promising, and most major cities in the US are already considering it. They're at a planning stage. We have major cities like London, Stockholm, Singapore that are already doing this, and they have success doing it. And I should add that, since this is about the Biden administration and 2021 and the future, so Biden has just announced his pick for transport secretary, and he's nominating Pete Buttigieg, who was also a Democratic nominee earlier this year. And Buttigieg was unique because he actually detailed out some very specific policies, including in transport. And something he really was pushing for was mileage-based road user fees, and using some of that revenue to fund all of those infrastructure upgrades that we need. So your roads, bridges, ports, railways, and bike lanes, and all of that. So
yeah, so
that's insightful, Edward. Yeah, I know that I had seen some statistics from a year or two ago that the U.S. had been using as much fuel in 1998 as it did in say 2017 or 2018. And unfortunately, it's because the cars are more efficient, there's more wear on the roads, and there haven't been the resources there to even pave roads and do road striping. That situation only gets worse when we have electric vehicles that don't pay a gas tax. So clearly there needs to be some kind of fix, and it's not all high occupancy toll lanes, which has been the typical go-to over the last couple of years.
Yeah, actually, a very good point, Jim, because as an electric vehicle owner, when I buy electricity for my car or make it from my own solar panels, there's no road tax paid. And obviously that ultimately will, the cost of maintaining roads and infrastructure is a pretty huge cost. So I did want to divert a little bit into the cost of gasoline. Obviously you have road tax. One of the other big issues that will come up it really preceded the Biden administration is will there be a carbon tax, and that carbon tax applied to gasoline and diesel? So the carbon tax has in the past always been political suicide. However, there's kind of a growing consensus, among various economists and organizations, even the Climate Leadership Council, which is, attended by Exxon, Mobil, Shell, Total, all recommend a carbon tax as the most equitable way of shifting our carbon resources, our hydrocarbon emissions, to a more carbon-free activity rather than the government picking winners and subsidizing the alternatives to the gasoline. So by taxing carbon, you would encourage car companies to, first of all, have higher fuel efficiency for one. It would also reduce the competitiveness. The Climate Leadership Council suggests a starting price of $40 per metric ton of CO2. How this unfolds is a little bit uncertain. So, but I also wanted to backtrack. One of the things that I have some experience with is making gasoline. I had done a lot of work with blending and making gasoline and diesel fuel. So I wanted to digress a little bit. One of the things is, gasoline has solved all kinds of environmental problems over the past. We took the lead out. Tetraethyl lead is a toxic pollutant. We found other alternatives to keep the octane level high. We also then, as a result of the Clean Air Act amendment in 1970, the EPA sampled all the air over all of the towns and cities around the U.S. and came up with reformulated gasoline requirements. All right. And those gasoline requirements basically started to impact all of the properties of gasoline, and the reformulated fuels, and even and to some extent, the EPA reformulated fuels, and the California Air Resource Board had their own regulations. But this impacted all of the properties of gasoline: RON, MON, road octane, RVP, density, lead, sulfur, aromatics, olefins, unburned hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, NOx, TOX, volatile organic compounds. And it did this by, first of all, insisting that oxygen content had to be 2.5 weight% of the gasoline. And at first we used MTBE, now we're using ethanol. And one of the key points is that, and there's also considerable regulations also in diesel. Both diesel and gasoline, I think, are down to 15 parts per million sulfur. So they took the sulfur out, and that helped to solve acid rain. But the key problem is that the gasoline is very difficult to remove the CO2, because if you burn, let's say you burn 15 gallons of gasoline, it weighs about 95 pounds. It makes roughly a little over 100 pounds of water, but it makes over 300 pounds of CO2. There would be no practical way of capturing CO2 with carbon capture and storage in a mobile vehicle. You'd have to refrigerate the exhaust. It would be absolutely uneconomical to do that. So there's, unlike generating electricity, you can have carbon capture and storage with integrated combined cycle and gasification power plants. Natural gas would be particularly useful. It's a little bit harder to do that in the stack after it's burned, such as you would see in a coal-fired power plant. But in any case, CO2 is a very hard pollution problem to solve, and you can't just remove it like we have with all the other problems that we've had for pollution-related issues with gasoline and diesel.
Yeah, it's fundamentally different. It's not just something that's there as an artifact in the mix. It's central to the combustion process. That's central to the oxidation process. So it's a different beast completely. And so you mentioned the potential for a carbon tax, Rick, and so that's really not the center of all this, but if that's a policy where if that had been implemented originally, we wouldn't be having a lot of these conversations, and a lot of the sort of policy mechanisms built recently are, they're tangential to that, or they're sort of a replacement for it in a roundabout way. But you bring up a good point that at this point in time, most economists, whether regardless of their politics, are more or less in agreement that the best way to deal with this problem is to make people pay for the externality into the atmosphere. And there's even a really interesting twist to this where it doesn't have to be a revenue generating tax, because then of course people of a more conservative bent would argue that it's a burden on the economy and it's just a larger government budget, which is a fair point. But a revenue neutral carbon tax, which you would call a carbon fee and dividend program, it's something that They toyed with in Canada as well. So the idea is you put a fee for carbon, but then you redistribute a portion of that fee to every company and person, proportional to the number of people or number of companies in the submarket or however you structure it. So the idea is you're incentivized to pollute even less because you're actually getting money back. And so if you're in an ecosystem of, 10 chemical companies, 10 steel companies, and you're all paying for the carbon that you emit, but you're all getting a tenth of the total revenue back. Well, every dollar that you reduce your pollution and paying into this fund, you're actually getting your competitors' fee into your own pocket, and you're saving money at the same time. So it's a very elegant way to do it, revenue neutral, and you sidestep a lot of the sort of political considerations there as well.
I would like to mention, of all the options there are to reduce CO2 and prevent global temperatures from rising beyond roughly, say, 2 degrees centigrade over the next 50 years, or by 2050, I think is a lot of the targets. There's a simulator called En-ROADS, EN-ROADS. You search that on the internet, you can get that simulator. And that simulator allows you to manipulate 18 main variables with a lot of additional tuning factors. And of all the variables you might manipulate, such as more nuclear, cutting more trees down, planting more trees, population, economy, carbon tax. Carbon tax comes out as being the most single effective part of the solution, but it's by itself insufficient to solve the temperature rise. And it's very interesting to try to play with such a simulator because it basically puts you in charge of the whole world, right? Because this is not just the US, this is a world-class simulator for how the world has to participate. And the interesting thing is it's pure physics. It doesn't matter whether you have a Republican agenda or a Democratic agenda, although it could be that your particular preferences might be different depending on your political background or your scientific background, or how you do it. But it gives you a chance to play with modeling and simulation. I would highly encourage people to try that and practice that. It's a very easy to use. It was put out by a group from MIT. It's constantly being updated, and it's considered one of the it's considered a very useful tool to help figure out what you can do and how you might what variables you can manipulate and how they interact. And it's very surprising. Electric vehicles alone is certainly not anywhere near enough to solve global warming. It helps, but it's not so much. All right.
Rick and Edward, we do have a few questions. Let me get started with a question for Ron. If self-driving vehicles will compete with transit in the future, won't that impact begin to be felt in 40 or 50 years and not in the next 10 or 15?
Did you say for me or for Rick?
For either one of you.
Okay, sure. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So we're seeing, we've seen AVs in development for years now. And we all remember 2016, 2017, where we were at the peak of that hype cycle and everyone said, oh, you're going to get an autonomous Uber in 2 years to your doorstep. And clearly 3-4 years later, we've seen that's not the case and that these problems are a lot harder than people thought. So progress has been much slower, but that said, we are at a point now where you could, if you're in Arizona, you can jump into an autonomous Waymo taxi run by Google, and there's not a person on board, even just sitting there with their hands, in their pockets. So it's sort of a yes and no. I mean, it's happening slower than we originally thought, but very steadily, and it's growing quite rapidly. It's mostly limited to places with good clear weather, so Arizona, California, but that's changing quickly. So I wouldn't be surprised if we started to see a lot more of this in the next 10 years. But personally, I don't believe we're going to have full level 5 autonomy in all road conditions, in all road networks anytime soon. So I would agree with the audience member there.
Yeah, and I'd like to just jump in that I think it's going to be incremental. And I think that competition between self-driving vehicles and traditional transit may be down the road. Most of the applications that I tend to see, we get involved with, are short distance local shuttles that are autonomous, that actually serve to support the local mass transit, bus station, light rail, train station. Those either run on a on a 3-mile route typically, or within perhaps maybe a 1 square mile area that's been previously mapped out. So there are no surprises for that vehicle. So that is beginning to happen. And I think you really need to just put this in a larger perspective that, one of the large transportation developments, certainly, perhaps the largest, is vehicle electrification. The next is really Internet of Things and IoT and its impact on that whole ecosystem, because now we can connect and can have a mobility as a service provider or an application that does give you your time and your cost of travel to take various types of routes. So your Uber car share or individual car might be one price, but if you'd like to save a few dollars and maybe it might take you a little longer, you might want to take the scooter to the light rail to the downtown and maybe only take an Uber for the last mile. All of those mobility as a service applications are very dynamic and are growing very quickly. And many of them, in fact, are also include a blockchain ledger for privacy. So there's a lot of different aspects to this. It's not just the vehicle electrification, and it's not just the autonomous vehicle. It's also that larger integrated platform, transportation management system platform.
Yeah, I wanted to point out the difference. The two leading contenders for self-driving are probably Waymo and Tesla. Tesla has released beta versions of their self-driving to specific vehicle owners, and they're kind of in a testing mode. Waymo also has permission to drive in certain areas, but there are two different technologies using. Waymo basically has the concept of using a very precise GPS sensors and to know exactly where they are and require, therefore, very accurate, updated maps to keep cars in an area. So Waymo is kind of optimized for having a city that's already been very accurately mapped out, but the requirement is, of course, to keep those maps up to date. Whereas Tesla suggests that they have the more general solution because they are using radar. They have a forward-mounted radar and 7 cameras and all the optical expert system to identify that. And so they think that they can drive on much wider range of vehicles. They don't depend on GPS specifically for part of the self-driving functions. Now, because we're starting to come to the close, there's 2 more items that I wanted to bring into this discussion. One of which is hydrogen-powered vehicles, and the second is which I'm actually going to make the first topic, is vehicle to grid and/or the interaction of your vehicle to the electric grid. Most people think of vehicles as primary purpose is mobility, but the fact that vehicles are parked so often, it's very possible, that vehicle can participate in the electric grid in a number of ways. My background in utilities are petrified of large numbers of electric vehicles coming home, plugging in at 5 or 6 o'clock at exasperating peak load on a hot summer day. And clearly they're making a lot of activities to prevent that event, because in order to provide electric service for them, if the consumer does nothing and does in fact plug in at 5 or 6 o'clock, the electric utilities will have to build more peaking units and larger diameter wires on the transmission lines at great expense, a far greater expense than it would be for the consumer to do what's called vehicle V1G, which is already in place and rolling out right away, which is basically scheduling of your charging. There's a lot of obstacles to this, and I've made presentations on vehicle to grid. There's no financial incentive. There needs to be a financial incentive and a market that homeowners can participate in to be rewarded for shifting their electric loads that could be hot water heaters, electric vehicles, HVAC systems to the non-peak times of the day, because that will save utilities money. The other interesting thing is that, most people, you can buy a little kit for a Toyota Prius that turns it into a portable generating station, 240 volt outlets and 110 volt outlets in the back. Just open up the trunk and you can have power at any remote location where there is no electric power. And as it depletes the battery, the gasoline engine fires up and charges the battery until you run out of gasoline. Well, a battery electric vehicle can do that for much longer and much more efficient than can a Toyota Prius. I don't know of any kits available for Teslas or Rivians or Fords or Porsches or Audi e-trons, etc. But it certainly could come. But that adds the possibility of vehicle to grid, that during those peak load times, you could take power out of your electric vehicle and push it into your house. I could, for example, run my house for 4 days straight. If just on my electric, on my car battery alone. So it could provide backup. Then the next topic that I wanted to bring up, and that is hydrogen for vehicles. You can see the Japanese were very interested. Toyota makes the Mirai, a hydrogen-powered vehicle. It has decent range, and hydrogen has the unique characteristic that it is the huge energy density, because each 2 pounds of hydrogen, H2, with one oxygen 16, is an 8-to-1 ratio of oxygen that comes out of the air compared to the hydrogen that needs to be carried in the vehicle. Whereas battery electric vehicles have to carry all their power in the battery. But in any case, hydrogen probably has a future role on the electric grid as a storage element. It doesn't appear that it's going to be competitive, in part because of the infrastructure, the charge. You'd have to have pipelines and hydrogen filling stations all over the country. That's a huge complexity and expense. Hydrogen also has a certain number of hazards, as it has a very wide range of explosive limits. It's not the world's easiest thing to handle because of the high pressures that are absolutely required to have any reasonable amount of storage. I think the Mirai is at least 2,500 pounds of pressure. So it's very, very high pressure. But anyway, hydrogen probably has a future. It may have more of a future in larger vehicles like trucks or trains, where some of its advantages can come in. But we don't see at ARC here, at least, hydrogen is being competitive in the automotive sector.
Mm-hmm. I should also add that, 100% agreed about the automotive sector. We've talked about this a lot, but there is a specific use case regarding distributed energy generation. So when you have wind capacity in the North Sea, and you have companies with turbines out there, and the wind is just roaring, and there's not enough demand, the marginal cost of that power is nothing. And so now companies are piloting using that excess, cheap, clean energy to hydrolyze water and store that energy in compressed hydrogen. Not with the use case of then pumping that into a vehicle, but then with just reversing the process at another time and generating electricity from that. So I think it's going to have a place in the green economy, just probably not in your personal vehicle.
Yes, I would see that, rather than curtail electric production because supply and demand are out of balance. So in some cases, electricity, and this will happen more in the future, the cost of electricity on the grid could go negative. You would be paid to consume it. Clearly, even with the lower efficiency of hydrogen, fuel cells, electrolyzers and fuel cells, that's an issue. But once you have hydrogen, there are a lot of other options. Once you have hydrogen, you can make gasoline, you can make diesel fuel from hydrogen. Not necessarily the most efficient routes to handle that chemically, but hydrogen has some distinct advantage over, say, for example, lithium-ion batteries in terms of longer-term storage possibilities. And we're talking really green hydrogen. All right. I mean, blue hydrogen is made by reformers in refineries and things, and that would be the prominent way hydrogen is made today. The number of electrolyzers out there, but I think that hydrogen will have a role on electric storage in the electric utility industry, and it could also obviously directly be used to make things like ammonia fertilizer, as hydrogen is the main feedstock for making ammonia, and a few other chemical materials as well.
In the last few moments that we have left here, about 10 minutes, one topic we really didn't cover is safety. I know, Edward, you mentioned in the beginning that in the U.S. almost people a year die in vehicle crashes. Additionally, about 3 million are non-fatally injured, and the CDC costs that out as over a $75 billion annual impact. Some years ago, there had been the initiative of connected vehicles within the U.S. Department of Transportation that uses a 802.11p peer-to-peer 100-meter network. I know you're doing some work in that area. Can you give us a few insights there?
Yeah, definitely. And that was actually the last point in my notes here. So yeah, like you said, connected vehicles, they often don't get a lot of attention, especially in proportion to just how much benefit they could have. And like you're saying, the idea is vehicles would be sending messages to one another, to roadside infrastructure, to infrastructure owner operators, and it would help vehicles avoid each other and avoid collisions, maybe avoid pedestrians, and be better prepared for weather events and road conditions down the road.
To be clear, this is not to be confused with autonomous vehicles or self-driving or anything like that, correct?
Yeah. So this is not much of a technological leap. In fact, all of these applications have been in testing for about 2 decades, and there are pilots all over the world, and they're mostly very successful. So the tech is not really the problem. At this point, it's been mostly a regulatory hurdle. So just the very quick history is that about 20 years ago, the FCC set aside part of the EM spectrum as safety spectrum. So specifically for connected vehicle safety applications. And then and so that led to a lot of testing, piloting, development. And then in 2016, the Obama administration's DOT mandated that all new passenger vehicles would have onboard units. They'd be equipped for connected vehicle applications. The next administration scuttled that plan. And in the last year or two, the FCC has decided they've proposed to slash the safety spectrum by 60 or 70%. The result of that would be it wouldn't be enough to actually support safety messages without interference. But with the election we just had, this might change. So obviously, Joe Biden was Obama's VP, and again, under the Obama administration, the safety spectrum was maintained, supported, and we saw that mandate. We also have the fact that the commissioner of the FCC, who's been pushing to slash the safety spectrum, his term ends in 2 years, but he has said that he will actually step down next month. So that means President-elect Biden will be able to nominate his successor. And again, if you look at what happened last time Biden was in the White House, you might conjecture that CVs will see a lot of support and protection of the safety spectrum. And just the last point here is that the incoming Transport Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, he's actually championed a national commitment to Vision Zero. So that's the idea that it's completely technologically feasible to have no road fatalities. There's no technological barrier, there's no law of physics here that says we have to have so many people dying and being maimed every year. So he wants to commit to a national Vision Zero roadmap, and that will almost undoubtedly include major support for connected vehicle applications. So we're expecting to see more of that going forward.
I did want to bring up a couple of points on the technology and autonomy and that's impact on safety, because there is definitely a correlation to they're separate from the vehicle to vehicle, other interactions that might also be a future technology that we see. Clearly, we see adaptive cruise control in a lot of cars. We see lane departure warnings in a lot of cars. These features are saving lives, saving accidents, reducing accidents. Tesla, for example, has gathered data that during those times that cars are under their advanced autopilot system, that their accident rate is, I'm not quite sure the exact numbers, but a factor of 3 or more reduced. And in fact, Tesla, as a result, is looking to offer their own automotive insurance to Tesla owners because they believe that their cars will be safer. Now, that said, it's also the point that the autopilot tends to be engaged on the safer highway miles rather than the more complex city traffic routes. So you need to interpret a little bit of how that data necessarily applies, because vehicles are driven, in a number of different environments. And also it tends to be disengaged during construction sites or difficult to navigate situations where accidents may have a higher frequency. But clearly a number of these technologies, and you see the technologies that have that can identify there's a person in front of you, automatically stop the car, and so these accident avoidance things have had, I think, quite a big impact and will continue to have a big impact on all vehicles, not just electric vehicles.
Yeah, there's no reason that in the US we should have 40,000 deaths, millions of injuries every year, and worldwide the numbers are so much higher. I think worldwide it's way over 1 million road deaths every year. I think is it 2 or 5? I mean, it's some horrible number, tens of millions of people injured, and that's every year. And again, there's no law of physics that dictates that should happen, so it really shouldn't be happening.
All right, great. Is there any other questions that we have from the panelists?
We do. We have, with the focus on electric vehicles, doesn't this mean that we will have cleaner congestion and that we'll have a cleaner environment, but that nothing will be done to congestion, meaning getting travelers out of their cars? I think we touched on that one. The last question is, our beginning reference was to Congress. Since transportation on the Hill is traditionally the least political sector, does this suggest that there's likely to be more cooperation than other committees and that the Biden agenda is likely to be realized? Anyone want to take that hot potato?
Yeah, I'll make just a quick comment on that. I even have it in my notes here, but I forgot to mention it. Infrastructure and transport are generally pretty apolitical, at least historically. They're probably the last thing to become a political football. And it makes sense why. I mean, roads and bridges and airports shouldn't be political. But unfortunately, in the last decade and a half, we've seen that not be the case, and we've seen major infrastructure, not even revamps, just maintenance, just pretty simple, basic functionality and basic ideas to maintain infrastructure get stalled. They tend to get dragged into to other more contentious issues, and they have these extra riders in the bills, and then they become poison pills and no one passes anything. So theoretically, yes, and it's possible that we do see action in the next few years, but the last 10 or so we have not seen that, and it's been unfortunate.
So I wanted to end up the session here with one thing I mentioned previously that give you a little bit more futuristic view. In many ways, you should be looking at the advancements in autonomy for air traffic management, for air taxis. Uber Elevate has a very good business plan that could allow miniature drone piloted like airports with 4 to 6 passengers per plane that would be very competitive with taxis and other activities. And you also see that huge advances in for lightweight vehicles, battery powered electric vehicles with redundant batteries, redundant motors, and known landing and spots, it's very feasible. And you certainly see huge investments done by Boeing and Airbus. There's a lot of electric drone vehicles coming here, and I have a spot in my backyard that would make a very good landing pad. One landing pad for drones for the delivery of packages, so we didn't need vehicles to do that last mile. And then another landing pad, for, I would particularly like this Lilium aircraft being developed in Europe. It's 250 miles an hour, almost 300 miles of range, very, very convenient to get from point to point, and definitely would unclog the roads.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of
well, Rick, thank you for that. Edward, do you have some closing remarks before I finish up here?
No, I think we've gone through a lot, but I will say there seems to be a confluence within the Biden campaign and transition around climate and around transport and energy. And you can see it in his nominations: transport, energy secretary. Again, John Kerry is having a major role. There's a new office for climate change in the incoming White House. And because this has been historically not that political, at least the basic infrastructure, it's very possible that we see positive developments here. So it's super exciting.
Great. Well, I want to thank Rick Rys, our senior energy analyst, and Edward Fidler today. This has been very insightful for me. I'd like to remind everyone that we hold these Smart City Digital Transformation Council meetings officially on a monthly basis, but occasionally every 2 weeks, as we've been in the last few months. Our next session in 2 weeks will be a review of the top 10 technologies for smart cities. That's on January 14th. And then on January 28th, we will be holding a smart workshop focusing on the IEEE Smart City Planning Standard, of which Edward and myself have leadership positions. Most importantly, attendance and registration at any of these digital transformation council meetings for end users gets you a complimentary ticket to 2 days of in-depth information on smart cities. Rick gave us a bit of a preview on his session, his 90-minute session on Tuesday, February 16th, on drones for inspection, delivery, and transportation. Rick will also be hosting a session on the future electric grid. Edward has sessions on the impact of electric vehicles and on connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and mobility as a service. And additionally, we have a few sessions on the impacts of COVID, on smart city cybersecurity, on smart city platforms, and on IoT and smart lighting, just to name a few. So if you are an end user and you are either an employee or work with a public agency, or you're a building or a campus owner, operator, or maintenance organization, and you would like a complimentary ticket to our 2-day forum coming up on the second week of February 16th and 17th, feel free to reach out to myself, Jim Frazer, or Edward, to Rick, or to anyone at ARC, and we'll make sure that we get you registered so that you can take advantage of this very timely and important information. So with that, I thank everyone for attending, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for the top 10 smart city technologies. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Yeah, thank you.
Great job, everybody.